As part of our first opening session on our 2.5 days, we have another great keynote speaker who's going to join us. Stas Burgel is with the National Invasive Species Council. I've had the pleasure of working with Stas on NISC through the affiliation of the ANS Task Force and through our regional panel work. Stas is going to join us today to talk about their major priorities and activities and opportunities for engagement. This is a nice follow-up to the piece that Hillary Smith gave us yesterday about the Department of the Interior and that family collaboration on aquatic invasive species work. Stas serves as the executive director of the National Invasive Species Council. He facilitates high-level policy dialogue on invasive species across the federal departments along with the White House. He's been with the NIST staff for over a decade, and he's responsible for overseeing the implementation of all of the NIST work and their work plans. He has consulted on a range of non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations with a particular focus on biodiversity policy and law. And if you follow a lot of the development of these pressing issues, you will find he is usually the primary author on a number of white papers that are being written to address pressing issues that we're trying to face across the nation relative to early detection, rapid response, et cetera. So welcome, Stas, and we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thanks, Meg. And just to confirm, can you see my PowerPoint slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, first, many thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I know I've talked with Meg a number of years about being able to participate in the society meeting, and fortunately, this is the occasion that I can, albeit virtually, but there are some advantages to having a virtual conference. So it's great to be here. It's also great to be sort of working with and engaging with folks in the Northeast. While the National Invasive Species Council, and I'll certainly talk more about it, has sort of a whole national context, it's nice to engage with particular regions that have their own particular sets of issues and interests. So it's really a pleasure to be here. And on that, I was able to participate or watch some of the presentations yesterday. It was nice to see overlaps with some of the work and interests that you have going on, thinking about Michael Tesler's presentation on environmental DNA and Ping Gong on advanced biotechnologies, and how that overlaps with some of the work we're doing at the national level. So there's certainly potential for synergies and further communications. What I'm going to talk about today, sort of three things. I'm going to give a little bit of background about the council for those who are not as familiar with it. Then the bulk of the presentation will focus on the substantive priorities in our FY21 work plan, and I'll conclude with just a few words about stakeholder engagement. And on this slide, I've included the mission statement for the National Invasive Species Council. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically providing the vision and national leadership to coordinate, sustain, and expand federal efforts to safeguard the interests of the U.S. from invasive species. So thinking about prevention, eradication, and control, as well as restoration. To provide a visual, the council includes the secretaries or administrators of 12 federal departments, as well as 4 White House offices. In 2016, there was an additional sort of 3 White House offices that were included, those being the Office of Management and Budget, Council on Environmental Quality, and Office of Science and Technology Policy. So previously, we were mostly working across the departments. With the addition of those new White House offices, particularly the focus on science, environmental policy, as well as budget, I think we sort of rounded out our whole of government approach. We have 3 co-chairs, which are within Departments of Agriculture, Interior, and Commerce. And while nominally the council members are supposed to be the secretaries and administrators, they delegate those responsibilities. It's hard to get airtime with those folks. So on a more practical level, we work with 2 levels. The first level we call the principals. These are usually high-level officials within the departments or the White House offices, often political appointees. So by example, for USDA, we had Undersecretary Greg Ibach in the remaining sort of present administration. For the Department of Interior, it's Principal Deputy Assistant Scott Cameron. So working with folks like that who make the more sort of important decisions, adopting clearing documents that we may have. On a day-to-day level, we work with what we call senior advisors. So yesterday you heard from Hillary Smith, who is the Department of the Interior's senior advisor to the council. And with them, we hold sort of monthly meetings. We sort of liaise with them on a one-on-one basis if there are issues relevant to their departments or agencies. And in the orange box, you know, the NISC staff, that's sort of where I sit. We've sort of had an ebb and flow in terms of the number of folks working in the staff. And we also help the interface with external stakeholders. In terms of the background history, the council was created by executive order in 2016. That executive order really focused on raising awareness both with the broader public as well as internally within the federal government itself. In 2016, there was a long needed update, which kind of shifted that focus more towards implementation. How do we deal with invasive species and their threats? Our work is guided by, or has been guided by, a series of management plans and work plans. I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail soon. The management plans generally were sort of supposed to be 3 years, and the work plans, which we're working under now, are 1 year. We also had for about 20 years the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, which is a FACA advisory committee, including non-federal representation from a range of constituencies. Over the term of ISAC, they developed 20 white papers and over 180 recommendations that were submitted to the council for consideration. And as Meg sort of alluded to, we've worked on a range of issues in the past. Some of the bigger ones have been early detection and rapid response, prevention and pathways, areas of technological innovation, issues of wildlife health, impacts on infrastructure, climate-related issues, as well as thinking about sort of policies and coordination at regional and international levels. So regional, thinking about the Pacific, the Arctic, North America, and at the international level, working both with environmental as well as trade, international negotiations and treaties. In 2019, 2020, we went through a bit of a transition. Part of that was kind of motivated by a decrease in staffing with sort of some reduction in capacity. And also was basically sort of 20 years since the creation of the council. So it was time for sort of a reconsideration, a refresh, and a look back in terms of what has worked and what hasn't. In that process, one of the key things that the departments were telling us was really focus on the coordination part of things as opposed to external projects and efforts like that. So we took that sort of as the basis for figuring out how to sort of streamline our activities. And one of the bigger pieces of that was moving from the 3-year management plan to a 1-year work plan. And there was kind of a threefold set of reasons for that. First was to be a bit more nimble and agile in terms of dealing with upcoming priorities. The problem we had with sort of 3-year work plans was that many of them extended to 5 years or more. They spanned across administrations, often with changing events. Some of the items that were put on there in the beginning were not as relevant, or things had changed subsequently by the time that sort of 3-year period had concluded. So given that we're working sort of at a high political level, priorities sort of changed, there was a need to be a bit more sort of agile in terms of the issues that we were addressing. Second reason was really to match the work that we were doing with our capacity. And then finally, just in terms of a communication standpoint, we've moved from some of the earlier management plans had upwards of 80 activities, which is hard to communicate in terms of saying, these are the priorities of the council. By example, or contrast, the 2020 annual work plan had 6 priorities. That's a lot easier to communicate both externally as well as internally. Some of the other things we did, sort of codified terms of reference, which had never been formally developed before, developed other standard operating procedures, as well as a stakeholder engagement strategy in the wake of the absence of our advisory committee. One last thing which was important, while our role is primarily focused on coordination between the departments as well well as White House offices, there are a number of sister interagency committees that help with, or that have their own sort of coordination role across federal agencies. And so another thing that we've done is to work better to coordinate with them. All, as you probably know, sort of state, municipal, other level, resource constraints is always a factor. And so we've tried to work with groups like the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, Federal Interagency Committee on the Management of Noxious Exotic Weeds, groups dealing with integrated pest management, biological controls, to figure out where there are intersections, where there are overlaps, and oftentimes how we can sort of coordinate our own work plans and activities to be sort of more synergistic. So just by example, we've been very involved with the ANSTF's Early Detection Rapid Response Subcommittee and sort of figuring out how does the work that we're doing, which I'll talk about in a little bit, complement ANSTF's work, and how do we sort of stage-wise process make sure that they're complementary. So now I'm going to turn a little bit more to the substantive work that we're engaged in. The work plan is, the FY21 work plan is separated into just kind of two areas: core coordination activities and thematic priorities. The core coordination activities are the things we do on a daily basis, the meetings we coordinate, information updates, responding to requests either from federal agencies or from non-federal partners or the public. And then the thematic priorities are really sort of where we're putting our substantive effort into. For the elements on the right-hand side, often those are also facilitated by interagency task teams that sort of bring experts from the various departments together to move forward on those issues. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more depth. So starting with rapid response, the activities in this area stemmed from the work that was done under the 2016 to 2018 management plan, which had a significant focus on early detection rapid response. In there, one of the main outputs was like 8 to 10 assessments of federal capacity, which were published in the Journal of Biological Invasion, basically looking at areas like incident command system, information systems, target analysis, things like that. In sort of reviewing that work, one of the things that we sort of realized was that there was more of a bias towards the early detection side of things than the rapid response. And so we included some items focused on that within the 2020 work plan that have carried over into 2021. The first of those is looking at the specific federal agency roles within rapid response, and that's recognizing that in many cases you've got federal agencies, state agencies, municipalities, landowners, et cetera. So what we're trying to do is to really delineate, including by looking at authorities, what are the specific roles that federal agencies can play. Part of that is just identifying what are the stages and steps within the rapid response process itself, which is listed on the right. But more interestingly is kind of the division that we've made in recognizing that there are different types of categories that federal agencies fall into. There are those that have primary emergency authorities. Think of a new species coming into the country, for example, a new regulated pest, and USDA's Animal Plant Health Inspection Service sort of has the jurisdiction to address that. There are also federal agencies that obviously have responsibility for the management of assets. Those would be sort of public lands, national parks, national forests. It could also be infrastructure, Bureau of Reclamation, and sort of dams and water infrastructure with the Army Corps, and transportation infrastructure. And those federal agencies have a responsibility for addressing invasive species in that context. And then finally, there's the situation where federal agencies are not a lead for a rapid response, but are rather sort of partnering or providing support, whether it's technical support, financial support, resources, whatever that might be. And so we've taken these categories, and what we're trying to do is work with specific federal agencies to really delineate what, by their authorities, what actions they can or cannot take. And hopefully that will sort of serve to improve coordination both with non-federal partners as well as work across federal agencies on rapid response activities. The second area in rapid response where we're working is on the criteria and considerations for an invasive species emergency response fund. Now, it's important to note that there are no sort of federal budgetary requests or actual appropriations for such a fund. However, recommendations about the need of a fund have been numerous from multiple levels. And so it was thought that it would be useful to go through the intellectual exercise of trying to figure out what would the parameters of a fund be, what are the critical questions that need to be asked, such that if the stars ever aligned and we had the ability to develop it, we would have this piece in place. Part of this has been looking at models of funding from other places, so invasive species funding and rapid response models from states, from regions, as well as emergency response funding models from other sectors. Think about fire, oil spills, Superfund, public health, and what are the lessons learned that could be moved over to the invasive species context. And with that, really identifying what are the criteria, thinking about funding sources, administration, scope, eligibility, those types of questions that would need to be asked. Some of the big things like, would it be regionally implemented versus nationally implemented? Would it focus all taxa or split out into aquatic, terrestrial, plants, animals, whatever that might be? We don't sort of come down on answering those questions. However, we recognize that their importance. And so we're trying to sort of set up the key questions that we need to be asked for the development of a fund if we get to that context. Environmental DNA, this was something I was pleased to see Michael Tesler's presentation yesterday, which I think did a great job in outlining it and also focusing on the plant context. A lot of activity going on in this area with federal agencies. What we've done, and this is sort of working with the interagency task team, is kind of take a step up and really ask the questions of what would a natural resource manager need to think about if they were considering the use of environmental DNA in their sort of specific context for monitoring and detection. This is resulting in sort of two pieces. The first is a technical paper, which has been submitted for professional journal review back in December. And we're hoping we get a sort of a decision on whether that will go forward soon. The second piece, which would be a council product, is sort of distilling some of the outputs of that, and then more generally, sort of recommendations relevant to the agencies on the use of eDNA for federal agencies. And that includes how to capitalize on existing sort of assets and programs, thinking about the practical implementation and interpretation of eDNA results, and then finally, how to sustain and build capacity within federal agencies and also where that supports non-federal partners. I'm not going to spend long on sort of the issue of wildland fire, given that we're focused more on the aquatic context, although there are certainly impacts of wildland fire and sedimentation post-fire and runoff to aquatic systems. I think the one thing that I will note here of interest is that we've partnered with the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, which in some ways is analogous to NISC, but it also includes representation from states, from municipalities and tribes. And so I think this is sort of a unique opportunity for us, specifically working on the area of wildland fire and invasive species, but also to try out new partnerships. So I'm excited to see where this will go. And then sort of the final area where we're expecting a concrete output is in the area of disaster response. And this is really looking at how to reduce the risks associated with the introduction and spread of invasive species associated with natural disasters and extreme weather events. Again, there are already a number of tools from federal agencies. The U.S. Geological Survey has their FAST mapper, which is a flood and storm tracker. So after a major storm, whether there's a storm surge or flooding, they can look at sort of the interconnection of waterways and water bodies to see where there might have been sort of movement of invasive species across those. So the two outputs that we're looking at here are, one, just trying to collate what are those tools that are available, and then second, think about those within the broader context of federal emergency response. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management administration has a full range of guidance for specific types of events, agricultural incidents, and what we're trying to sort of figure out is there room or the need for sort of more formal guidance relevant to invasive species and natural disasters? And that can include not just sort of the movement of invasive species by the event itself, but concerns that might need to be taken in the aftermath in terms of movement of vehicles, disposal of debris, and things like that. Now, while the previous areas I mentioned have sort of discrete outputs, along the lines of the interagency coordination, it was also recognized that there are some areas where there just simply needs to be dialogue across federal agencies. It might not be right for specific products, or various agencies might have activities already in hand or leading, but still require some sort of interagency support or interagency input. And so in this area, this is sort of a new type of activity for us in terms of inclusion in work plans. The 4 areas are listed up here. There's been a lot of work on information management, both with federal data resources, but also how do they coordinate with EDMAPs, with IMAP invasives. The Western Governors Association recently launched a data mobilization campaign. So, where are the synergies that we can sort of explore and promote there? With the National Environmental Policy Act, there was sort of recently new guidance that CEQ put out. Also, Hillary mentioned yesterday, I believe, some of the work that they're doing on categorical exclusions, and there's other discussions regarding streamlining CADXs within federal agencies. So how do we share the information, particularly the substantiation packages which go into that across federal agencies? Public health and advanced technology being sort of 2 other areas that there's interest in exploring. On that latter, I should say, with advanced biotechnology, there was interest in this, was on our work plan for 2020, wherein we developed a community of practice to share information across agencies. I've listed a number of the interested agencies on the right. Some of the areas that this group has explored have been, what are the specific applications for invasive species control? There's a lot of work around mosquitoes and rodents, but more broadly, how do we think about mussels, carp, things like that? Focus on risk, and this is not just the formal risk assessment requirements within the regulatory process, but also thinking about risk within the lab setting, within field trials. Third area was policy and regulatory frameworks. So starting with the coordinated framework for biotechnology products, which brings together the 3 main regulatory agencies, USDA, APHIS, EPA, and FDA, sort of to understand how the rules that they have, which have been more sort of applied to for commercial applications in the past, apply to the public good and environmental management, but also recognizing that federal agencies with land management responsibilities need to start thinking about, what do these tools mean for them and management on their lands, as well as more broadly, how do we interface with states, with municipalities, with the international arena on these issues as well. And then finally, some of the social and public engagement issues that surround the use of technologies like CRISPR, gene drives, RNA interference more broadly, and recognizing that the opportunities for public input into the formal regulatory process are certainly not adequate for the range of concerns that have been expressed, particularly in sort of using those technologies for environmental benefit. So the last area that I'm going to talk about in terms of our substantive work is we develop an annual cross-cut budget, and this just looks at federal funding on invasive species issues across the NISP member agencies. I've just put a summary. There's a series of 6 or 7 categories which are listed on the bottom of the screen, and this is just a summary of the spending over the past 10 years. I think the interesting thing for us will be looking at the 2020 numbers. A major portion of the light blue category on the bottom, which is prevention, are funds that go to both Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, as well as USDA APHIS for their border work. a substantial portion of those funds are generated by incoming tourists and cargo. And so with COVID and particularly the decline in international travel, those funds have decreased, causing a little bit of sort of, I don't want to say cause for concern, but sort of trying to figure out where to get the dollars to keep sort of staff on board. Not clear whether that represents additional risk or lower risk, but it's certainly something that we'll be looking at when we get the 2020 numbers. And I'm going to sort of close by just a note on stakeholder engagement. We are sort of particularly sort of eager to figure out sort of where there are intersections and interests with the work that's ongoing and that we're doing. Meetings like this and being able to sort of reach out opportunistically to interact with folks on a regional basis is particularly valuable because we get sort of better understanding of what's going on at the regional level, what's going on the state level, and seeing where the connections are to our work program. In many of the work plan activities, we've sort of designed into them sort of opportunities for input or reach out to specific stakeholders. And then we sort of have our panoply of regular outreach materials, website materials, things like that. But I would sort of welcome if you have sort of follow-up thoughts or you sort of see connections with work that you're doing. We're always interested in that type of input, and also making sure that federal agencies are aware of what's going on as well.
Thanks, Stas.